A Christmas Story, the cool version. Chapter 1. The Hole. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. That was the night, that's how it began, until Jake and Joe woke up at the sound of a slam. Our story begins at this time, deep in the middle of Christmas Eve night, and if you think this whole story will rhyme, you are sorely mistaken. Jake got up to look at the time and saw that it was 12 o'clock midnight. Then he heard a rustling noise down the hall. "Joe, are you awake?" he whispered. "Yeah. What was that noise?" Joe replied. I don't know. Maybe the cat knocked something over." Out of unspoken consent, they both tiptoed out of their bedroom door to find out what it was. Once they got out into the living room, they thought that nothing was out of place. But when they walked up to the Christmas tree, they saw that an ornament had fallen on the floor and broken. "This must be what the noise was," Jake whispered to Joe, picking up the ornament. Then Jake looked up at the tree. It was gloomy and dark because their parents had always turned off the lights during the night to save electricity. The more he looked at it, though, the more it seemed to pull him in. He couldn't look away. The black spaces in between the branches were calling his name. Jake. 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 Jake! Joe finally got Jake's attention. Jake spun around to find Joe over by the front of the hall, staring down at one of the tiles. As he walked closer to Joe, he began hearing a faint scratching sound. He came to Joe's side, realizing that the noise seemed to be coming from under the tile Joe was staring at. They glanced at each other, seeing fear in each other's faces, but they couldn't help but investigate further. Joe bent down and knocked faintly on the tile. The scratching stopped for a moment, then continued even more furiously than before. "Maybe we should just go back to bed," Joe hedged. "Wait," Jake said as he crouched next to Joe. He saw a small crevice he could fit his fingers into on one side of the tile. Using that crevice, he slowly pulled the tile up out of the floor to reveal a 1 foot by 1 foot square hole in the floor. They both peered into the complete darkness the hole contained. There was no sign of whatever had been making the scratching noise, but they kept looking. As a matter of fact, they couldn't look away. It felt as if the hole was pulling them in. "Not again," Jake thought, trying to shake himself out of it like Joe did for him when he called Jake's name. But then he looked around and realized he was actually being sucked into the small hole along with Joe. He looked just in time to see the living room whirl away and catch a glance of his brother's terrified face before they were completely engulfed in the black. Chapter 2. Lady Rainicorn and the Caterpillar King. When they opened their eyes, the first thing they saw was Lady Rainicorn with a broken jaw. Who did this, they asked her, but she couldn't speak. She just pointed and stared, tears rolling down her cheek. They looked where she pointed, and what did they see? A neat little river full of iced sweet tea. "Follow the river," her eyes seemed to say. They didn't waste time, and soon were away. They ran down the river till Jake fell down, and noticed a tiny caterpillar-sized crown. "That's mine," said a small voice to his right, and sure enough there stood a caterpillar, ready to fight. "Give it back, it belongs to me." So Jake gave it back to the Caterpillar King, whose complexion became much more pleasant after getting back such a precious thing. "I'm sorry, sir, I just found it here. We're just looking for the evil thing that hurt Lady Rainicorn's face. Have you seen him pass by here, King?" "Why, yes, indeed," the monarch replied. "'Tis the selfsame one who knocked off my crown. Just keep following the river to the open fields and chase the unjust fiend down." Chapter 3. Yummy Snow. So Jake and Joe kept running, looking for the field the king had mentioned. But before they knew it, it had started snowing. They huddled together for warmth as the snow fell and made a blanket of white on the ground. "I don't know if we should keep going," Joe said. "We'll end up freezing to death." "You're right. Maybe we should just camp here and try to stay warm," Jake complied. So they sat on a log, huddling together and shivering as the snow fell on them. After a while, they began to smell food. They were hungry after all the running and freezing, so they started searching for the source of the wonderful smell. Soon enough, Joe realized that the scent was coming from the very snow falling out of the sky. Picking up a bit of snow and smelling it, Joe told Jake of his discovery. "Smell the snow," he said. Sure enough, Jake came to the same conclusion. "The snow smells delicious." Slowly, Jake licked a bit of the snow in his hand. "And it tastes good, too." "Really?" Joe asked. He gave it a taste for himself, then began to eat the snow in lust. Not only did it taste good, but after the initial cold on his tongue, the snow somehow warmed him. It felt as if it had been years since they were truly warm, so they kept eating and eating. There was no way they would stop eating when it would just mean being cold again. As they ate more and more, their surroundings began to change. They didn't notice it at first because they were too focused on eating, but the trees were fading away to distant mountains, and the iced tea stream withered down to a line of ants in the dirt. And just as they were beginning to notice the change, the snow they had been eating off the ground turned into grass that they were pulling out of a large open field. They spat the grass out in detest. It didn't taste anywhere near as good as the snow. "Wow," Jake said, taking a look at his surroundings for the first time. "We found the field." Joe looked around too. "No one is here though. Maybe we're too late. The Caterpillar King will be angry." But just as Joe was getting the words out of his mouth, a figure appeared in the distance and began walking towards them. Chapter 4. Frosty. 'Twas Frosty the Snowman with evil red eyes and a dent in his fist. What a surprise! He must have punched Lady Rainicorn. The evidence was there in the snow. The boys were furious with Mr. Frosty, and he had nowhere to go. "You did this, you evil fiend!" Jake yelled at the magical frost. "You will pay for what you have done. Justice will not be lost." "Oh, and you will stop me?" Frosty snickered back. "It will take an army to stop Mr. Frosty, and an army is what you lack." "We have the power of Christmas spirit. We'll stop you where you stand. You are the one who hurt Lady Rainicorn. The evidence is on your hand." With that the boys jumped at Mr. Frosty and pinned him to the ground, and punched his snowy body to pieces with every single pound. Once he was just a blob of snow, melting in the sweltering sun. They jumped and cheered with Christmas joy at the justice they had done. They took Frosty's corncob nose and marched back on their way to show Lady Rainicorn what they had done on this beautiful Christmas day. And once they returned and gave her the nose, her jaw was magically fixed, and for their efforts she would give them a single Christmas wish. "We want to return home," they said all at once. "We miss our mom and dad, but we'll never forget what we've done here and the wonderful time we've had." So that was that, and she waved her wand and said the magical words. Then they were off to their home in a completely different world. Chapter 5. Conclusion. The next thing they knew when they opened their eyes was that they were back in bed. And when they got up and looked at the clock, it was still 12 o'clock midnight. So they decided to go out and check the tile and see if it would still open. However, when they got there, it was sealed tightly shut. But when Jake and Joe put their ears to the tile and listened very closely, they could still hear the sound of evil Frosty's stick fingers scratching on the other side.